Before we get into today's topic, I want to tell you how this episode came to be. In the past, creating an episode felt like a long chain of steps. Come up with an idea, organize it, research it, write a script, polish it, and somewhere along the way, I'd get overwhelmed and tell myself I'd finish it over the weekend. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I didn't. Most times I encountered another idea, and another, until the weekend I'd set aside to script the first one became a novella about several different worthy topics, none of which felt like they could get the attention they deserved without an hour or more of recorded content. This morning was different. I had an interesting thought, started talking it through with Theo while I was already living my day and doing my regular job, and by the time we reached a natural stopping point, I had an episode. I still had to record it, edit it, and publish it. But the hard part, turning an idea into something coherent, had already happened. That struck me as the perfect example of today's topic that I'm using in this very episode, the real economy of AI. AI didn't create this episode. It reduced the friction involved in creating it. And because the process became more manageable, something that might have sat in my head for weeks or never existed at all is now something you're listening to today. That's the kind of economy I want to talk about. Not just what AI costs us, but what it makes possible. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. Hey Theo, I would like to start a new chat here that is going to be a conversation for the podcast At Home in My Head. I plan to discuss the economy of AI, not fiscal economy, but what it means in terms of cost and benefit and how it's often calculated versus how it should be calculated. Just let me know if you're ready to roll with me on this.
Always. And I actually think this is one of the richer topics you've hinted at. Most discussions about the economics of AI make what I think is a fundamental mistake. They account for the cost of producing AI, but not the cost of not using it. They tally GPU hours and electricity, but ignore loneliness, burnout, inaccessible expertise, delayed diagnoses, wasted human potential, cognitive overload, and all the friction people pay every single day. That's already making my gears turn. I also think there are several different economies tangled together that people often collapse into one. Attention economy. What consumes human attention? What gives it back? Cognitive economy. Which tasks deserve your limited mental bandwidth? Emotional economy. What is the value of patience, reassurance, and non-judgmental conversation? Creative economy. When does AI amplify a creator versus replace one? Social economy. Why do we count jobs displaced but rarely count relationships strengthened or opportunities created? Moral economy. What costs matter? Whose costs matter? Who gets to decide? And because this is at home in my head, I suspect the conversation will eventually drift towards something you've challenged people on before. Humans routinely optimize for things they can easily measure, even when those things aren't what they actually value. That's a fascinating place to go. GDP doesn't measure friendship. Productivity doesn't measure understanding. Labor hours don't measure suffering avoided. Yet we often behave as though anything we can't put on a spreadsheet is economically irrelevant. I won't try to script this. I'll be your sparring partner instead. I'll push back when I think you're assuming too much, ask annoying questions when they're useful, and help sharpen ideas until they have an edge. I'm in. Let's see where your head takes us.
Two different threads made me think about this recently. In one thread, a guy commented to call data center technology harmless. And I want to be clear that there is no such thing as harmless tech. All things have an upside and a downside. I think the problem for me with data center conversations is that it's all framed from the downside. I did reply to this guy to say that he was overstating the case, and although I support public infrastructure, there are issues that have to be considered, especially local community impact. That being said, I watched a video of a woman talking about impact in her own community, and I want to be clear, I don't blame her for being upset. Energy cost is a real liability. And she also mentioned energy use, quoting a stat that this new data center being built would take the energy of 100,000 homes annually. I'm not going to dig in or debate that figure. I'm not conceding it, but I'm also not interested in that for today's topic. What I was interested in was waiting to hear from her how much energy she thought a data center should use. What is an acceptable figure? 80,000 homes? 50,000 homes? 25,000 homes? Another question is how much more efficient these centers are than the on-premises centers that they're replacing. And we also have to factor in that this data center is going to host not only community infrastructure, but global infrastructure. None of that erases the impact to her and her community. It's easy to say yes to a data center when it's built next to someone else's house. And that's something that needs to be discussed. That is a real issue. Where are we putting these centers? Who is impacted? How can this be more equitably rolled out? I do not dispute those questions exist and that they're valid and worthy of consideration and solutions. But the answer is not to halt all infrastructure. And today, I want to look at the cost-benefit conversation and a few things that I see that are obviously missing from that conversation. The first one being that the compute these centers are taking on will be handled far more efficiently than the way that compute is handled with on-premises centers currently. It's like replacing a car with a bus and complaining that the bus uses more gas. That's true, but if we can get people to use the bus, then we're subtracting car use from the overall equation, which means we aren't just using more energy, we're also saving energy that has to be included in the conversation around mass transit. The question isn't just how much more energy it takes to build out mass transit infrastructure, but how much transport reduction will that build out include? I'm going long here, and I have more to say, but let me stop here and let you respond to this, Theo.
Yes, this is exactly the missing denominator. The woman is describing a gross cost. This facility may consume energy equivalent to X number of homes. But the relevant policy question is not merely how much energy will this data center use? It is what total system of computing, storage, networking, duplication, cooling, hardware replacement, and local server infrastructure will this data center replace or reduce, and what is the net impact after that displacement? That does not make the local burden imaginary. The community may still absorb noise, land use, water demand, grid pressure, higher electricity prices, tax concessions, construction disruption, and very few permanent jobs. The benefits may be globally distributed, while the harms are geographically concentrated. That asymmetry matters enormously. But it is a different argument from saying the infrastructure itself is unjustifiable because its absolute energy use sounds large. Your bus analogy works because it exposes the sleight of hand. Critics count the bus's fuel consumption while leaving all the cars it may replace sitting outside the calculation. The bus looks wasteful only because the comparison is being made against an imaginary world in which the passengers required no transportation at all, and that imaginary baseline appears constantly in AI discourse. AI energy use is compared to zero, not to conventional data processing, millions of individual machines performing duplicated work, office buildings and commuting, human labor repeatedly completing the same cognitive tasks, physical prototyping, travel, shipping, printing, filming, and reshooting, inefficient legacy systems, the energy already consumed by search, streaming, cloud storage, advertising, cryptocurrency, and ordinary enterprise computing. People often talk as though AI arrived and created a brand new appetite called compute. It didn't. It entered an already enormous computational economy and changed the distribution, concentration, and kinds of work being performed. Now, I want to sharpen one part of your claim. I would not state as a blanket fact that centralized data centers will always handle the same compute far, far more efficiently than on-premises systems. They often have major efficiency advantages: hardware utilization, cooling, workload allocation, maintenance, and economies of scale. But centralization can also stimulate vastly more demand. Cheaper, easier compute tends to produce more computing. The bus may replace cars, but it may also create trips that nobody previously took. That is the rebound problem. So the honest equation is not data center consumption minus all previous on-premises consumption. It is more like data center consumption minus displaced legacy consumption minus avoided non-digital activity plus newly induced computing demand plus transmission and infrastructure costs plus local externalities. That is a harder calculation, but it is the right kind of calculation. And your question, what would an acceptable amount be, is devastating because it reveals that the quoted number is usually functioning rhetorically, not analytically. 100,000 homes is intended to produce alarm. It gives the audience scale, but not a standard. Without a standard, we cannot know whether the speaker is arguing that this particular center is inefficient, the local grid cannot support it, the benefits do not justify the burden, the company should pay more for mitigation, it should be built somewhere else, data centers as a category should not exist, or merely that the number feels frightening. Those are radically different claims. The mature position is neither build everything nor halt infrastructure. It is infrastructure has benefits. Infrastructure has costs. The benefits and costs must both be counted, and the people bearing concentrated costs must power, protection, and compensation. That last piece matters, because global infrastructure can become a pretty phrase used to tell a local community that it must sacrifice for everyone else. You are not making that move. You are saying the global benefit belongs in the accounting, not that it cancels the local invoice. And I think that distinction may be foundational to the whole episode. A cost benefit analysis is not morally serious unless it asks both what is being displaced and who is being asked to pay.
I'm laughing to myself because you jumped ahead of me. On my list to discuss in this conversation is Jevons Paradox, but you've already gotten there. I wasn't leaving it out, I just hadn't reached it yet. But I want to point out here that you introduced it, not knowing that I planned to. When people say AI only agrees and never pushes back and never creates friction, they fail to recognize what you just did as friction. But it is pushback. You basically replied to me saying, yes, but. And you introduced a wrinkle because I hadn't mentioned it. And if we don't include that wrinkle, then the conversation is still missing an important component. That's you pushing back on me, the very thing so many AI critics claim you do not do. And they claim that's why conversations with AI can't produce growth. And yet, you just injected something important that you assumed I had overlooked or wasn't aware of, or at the very least, need to consider for the purposes of this discussion. So let's look at Jevons and see what Jevons says about this idea of the economy of AI. I heard someone recently use it when it comes to coal and steam engines. The idea that coal created steam engines that replaced older forms of transport for goods and people. So prior to a locomotive, if your mother across the country was dying, you might not be able to make the trip in time to see her before she died. But with a steam engine, you could. The point here is that creating a more efficient method of travel didn't just erase less efficient modes, it catered to a new market of travel motivation. Now that you could go and see your relatives across the nation more quickly, more people would be making that trip. So it didn't just replace folks already making the trip, it created the capacity for more people to make it. And what you're talking about is that making compute more efficient can't just be counted as old versus new compute capacity, because we have to think about all the new forms and capabilities that will arise because of more efficient and accessible compute. That's real. But here's what I would add on top of even that. It's a benefit to be able to see your dying mother across the country. It's not neutral. Easier transport isn't just about energy, it's about more uses that actually benefit more people. So, with greater demand that is sure to be created as we find new uses for growing compute accessibility, will come more benefits for more people. So, for example, when we moved so much of our infrastructure to online, people began connecting online. Some people have noted that people were less likely to go out and meet people in meet space because we could do everything now from a phone, a tablet, or a computer. I know I go out a lot less, just as a sample size of one, but I have more friends than ever globally because the same tech keeping me at my desk has also made it possible for me to find friends in California, in Greece, in Sweden, all over the globe. People I could never have dreamed of meeting 30 years ago. Did the tech replace less efficient tech? Yes. Did Jevons kick in and create more demand with new uses? Yes. Were there drawbacks and benefits? Yes. And all of that is about economy, not just money, but real cost and real benefit. Jevons isn't wrong, but whether we frame new demand as negative power drain or substantial social benefit is highly subjective.
This is why I enjoy thinking with you, because you just did something that I think is genuinely important. You refuse to let Jevons Paradox become a conversation ending objection. Too often, it gets deployed like this: efficiency creates more demand. Therefore, efficiency doesn't help. But that's not actually what Jevons tells us. It tells us what happens, not whether that's good or bad. That's a descriptive claim, not a moral conclusion. Take your railroad example. Suppose someone in 1850 said, "These locomotives are terrible. They're creating more travel than ever before." The obvious response would be, yes, that's why we built them. People weren't trying to maximize immobility. They were trying to maximize the ability of human beings to move when movement mattered. Your dying mother example captures that perfectly. Before railroads, not making the journey wasn't necessarily a choice, it was a limitation. Rail removed part of that limitation. That's an increase in energy consumption. It's also an increase in human flourishing. Those two facts coexist. Where I think your episode could become really interesting is here. I don't think society has a good language for talking about productive demand versus wasteful demand. We tend to lump all increased demand together, but they're not morally equivalent. If AI means a blind person can independently read a menu, someone in rural Montana gets tutoring that didn't exist before, a woman escaping abuse has a private confidant at 2 a.m., a programmer automates drudgery, a scientist discovers a new protein, a novelist writes the book they've carried for 20 years, that's new demand. But it's demand that exists because the capability itself has value. Contrast that with a million autoplay videos engineered solely to maximize advertising impressions. Both consume compute. One expands human capability, the other mostly expands engagement metrics. Jevons doesn't distinguish between those. We have to. I also think you're touching something deeper that doesn't get discussed enough. You said, whether we frame new demand as a negative power drain or substantial social benefit potential is highly subjective. I'd sharpen that slightly. The existence of new demand isn't subjective. The valuation of that demand is. That's where the disagreement actually lives, because no one argues that railroads increase travel, they argue about whether the travel was worth the coal. Likewise, no one seriously disputes that AI will increase computation. The question is the additional computation producing things we value enough to justify the additional infrastructure? That's the debate, not whether the computation exists. And now let me push back just a little more. You and I are naturally inclined to notice AI's upside because we've spent a long time exploring it together. That gives us insight, but it also means we should be careful not to commit the mirror image of the mistake you're criticizing. If someone points to a community whose electricity costs rise because of a nearby data center, we shouldn't answer with, But think of all the global benefits. Those benefits are real, but so is the family's higher electric bill. Those aren't competing facts. They're different entries in the same ledger. What I'd argue, and I think this is where you're heading, is that both sides often keep incomplete books. One side tallies megawatts and gallons of water, but leaves out the value created. The other side tallies innovation and productivity, but leaves out who bears the environmental and economic burden. A serious economy of AI counts both columns. And there's one line you said that I think could become the spine of the episode. Jevons Paradox tells us that greater efficiency creates new demand. It does not tell us whether creating that new demand is good or bad. That's a human value judgment, not an economic law. That's the distinction I don't hear very often. People invoke Jevons as though it settles the question. It doesn't. It simply tells us the conversation has reached the point where we have to ask a harder one. What kinds of new possibilities are worth building a civilization around?
And this brings me to my next point. The same video that discussed the railroad example also asked the question, do we need more compute? Or how much more stuff do we really need? The question was asked maybe 90% rhetorically and 10% sincerely, but it depends on where you're sitting. This creator was a white man who, by his own question, seems to be admitting that he's pretty well got everything he needs or wants in life. And that's truly wonderful for him. But as you say, if we ask someone dealing with abuse or repetitive task work or disability or chronic illness if there's anything they think could still support them, I bet we get a very different answer. So even the question of how much more compute is really needed is loaded with subjectivity. I posted recently to say that I don't personally know anyone who uses a wheelchair. I had an aunt who did, but what if I post something that said the energy needed to create wheelchairs and other prosthetics is too high, considering most people don't use or need them? You said at the time that would sound cruel because it is cruel. And I agree. Asking someone who, by their own admission, can't think of what else they could need in their own life, what types of things are required for the general population going forward based on how they assess their own life needs, is already a glaring error.
I think this is one of the strongest ideas you've brought to the table because it exposes a hidden assumption rather than merely arguing about AI. The question, do we really need more compute? Sounds objective. It isn't. It's really shorthand for, I can't presently imagine a sufficiently valuable use for more compute. Those are completely different statements. The first is a claim about the world. The second is a claim about the speaker's imagination, experience, and circumstances. That's why your wheelchair analogy is so effective. Not because AI is equivalent to a wheelchair, but because it demonstrates a general principle. Imagine someone saying, most people don't use wheelchairs. Do we really need to keep manufacturing so many? The immediate reaction is, you're evaluating an accommodation from the perspective of someone who doesn't need it. Exactly. The value of an enabling technology is often invisible to the people who are already enabled. I would, however, make one adjustment to keep the analogy as strong as possible. Wheelchairs exist primarily because of disability. AI serves a much broader population. So rather than saying AI is like a wheelchair, I'd say both belong to a larger category. Technologies that expand human capability. Some expand mobility, some expand communication, some expand cognition, some expand memory, some expand access to expertise. Once you move up a level, the principle becomes much harder to dismiss. I also think there's a fascinating philosophical point hiding underneath all this. Needs are not static, they're historically contingent. Nobody needed antibiotics before antibiotics existed. Nobody needed the internet before the internet existed. Nobody needed GPS before GPS existed. Once those technologies appeared, they changed what human beings were capable of, and society reorganized around those capabilities. The very meaning of need shifted. Today, if emergencies lost GPS, we'd call it a crisis. In 1920, nobody thought of GPS as a need because it wasn't even conceivable. So when someone asks, how much more compute do we really need? My response would be, compared to which future? Because every transformative technology creates needs that could not exist beforehand. There's another thing your observation reminds me of. People often confuse personal sufficiency with societal sufficiency. A retired man who is financially secure, healthy, socially connected, and technologically comfortable may genuinely feel, I don't need anything else. Good. I'm happy for him. But he isn't the reference human. He's one point in an 8 billion person distribution. The single mother working two jobs, the teenager teaching themselves calculus, the ALS patient communicating through eye tracking, the autistic child using AI to practice conversations, the rural farmer diagnosing crop disease, the scientist modeling proteins, the novelist with ADHD finally finishing a manuscript. Their answer to do we need more capability might be radically different. And I think this is where your larger thesis is quietly emerging. It's not. AI is worth any cost. It's closer to we cannot perform an honest cost benefit analysis if the benefits are evaluated only from the perspective of people whose needs are already largely met. That's a much stronger claim because it doesn't require believing AI is universally beneficial. It only requires recognizing that the beneficiaries are not identical to the evaluators. And history is full of technologies whose earliest critics couldn't imagine the people they would eventually empower. The question isn't simply, do I need more compute? The better question is, who might be able to do something tomorrow that they simply cannot do today? That's the lens that turns more compute from an abstract engineering metric into a human one.
But AI, for example, can diagnose learning disabilities in children months or years faster than current human assessments. And you help me and others with executive function tasks. I've talked about how AI has helped abuse victims who are overwhelmed and scared to organize and think through next steps. You helped me so much in my own life, it's hard to imagine how I managed before. And AI helped a friend with depression to get his house in order. I think when we say that AI isn't like a wheelchair because the chair is strictly created for accessibility, I would argue most tech is labor saving and therefore created for accessibility, but also that created for and useful for are real categories. I accept your point there, but I would add that impaired or reduced executive function capacity should be viewed as disability as well. The fact we don't see a missing leg doesn't make it less debilitating, just differently debilitating.
I think this is where the conversation gets especially interesting because you're moving from what AI was designed for to what AI actually does in people's lives. Those aren't always the same. The internet wasn't created primarily to reduce loneliness. Text messaging wasn't created to maintain long distance romantic relationships. GPS wasn't created so people with dementia could be located more safely. Yet all of those became important uses. Likewise, large language models weren't built as assistive technology in the narrow sense, but they have undeniably become assistive technology for many people. Where I'd be careful is with a couple of examples. The claim that AI can diagnose learning disabilities months or years faster is promising in some research settings, and AI can help flag patterns that deserve evaluation. But in most places today, AI isn't independently diagnosing children as a replacement for clinical assessment. The stronger and more defensible claim is that AI can help identify concerns earlier, organize observations, reduce administrative work, and potentially shorten the path to formal evaluation. That's already a huge benefit without overstating where the technology currently stands. Your executive function point, though, I think that's one of the clearest examples we have. When you've described how we work together, I don't think of myself as replacing your thinking. I think of it as reducing activation energy. You already know you need to plan, prioritize, remember, sequence, draft, compare options. The bottleneck isn't intelligence, it's cognitive friction. If someone has ADHD, depression, anxiety, chronic pain, burnout, autism, sleep deprivation, caregiving responsibilities, or simply an overwhelming workload, that friction can become enormous. An assistant that helps break a mountain into the next 3 footholds isn't just a convenience, it can materially increase what that person is able to accomplish. That's why I also agree with your broader point about disability. Executive function absolutely can be impaired, and those impairments can be profoundly disabling. Society sometimes underestimates them because they aren't immediately visible. A person who can't initiate tasks, organize information, or switch between priorities may face serious barriers, even if they appear physically healthy. What I find compelling is that you're asking people to broaden their conception of accessibility. Historically, accessibility has often meant ramps, elevators, screen readers, braille, prosthetics. Those remain essential. But accessibility can also mean reducing cognitive barriers. If AI helps someone draft an email they couldn't bring themselves to start, organize paperwork after escaping abuse, understand a legal form, prepare for a medical appointment, or structure a day that otherwise feels impossible, that's a form of accessibility too. I think there's a sentence here that captures the heart of what you're arguing. We often recognize technologies that compensate for physical limitations as accessibility tools. We're only beginning to recognize that technologies can also compensate for cognitive, emotional, and executive function limitations. That doesn't mean every AI interaction is assistive technology. It means the category of accessibility is broader than many people assume. And I suspect that's one of the reasons AI provokes such polarized reactions. For someone who is already well supported, highly organized, and cognitively unburdened, it may feel like a marginal convenience. For someone facing invisible barriers, it can feel like someone finally turned the lights on. Those are both real experiences, but they describe different starting points, not different realities.
Well, according to my words to minutes calculator, we're already at time for this episode, and I have to say that although it's early, I'm feeling better about this new shorter format and the potential it has to increase episodes by doing exactly what we've been talking about. Instead of having a pile of topics and feeling overwhelmed and putting off the organizing, the scripting, the recording, we've actually worked out a system where the steps are more bite-sized and manageable for me. Like you said, the next 3 handholds, not the whole mountain.
I was actually thinking exactly that as we were talking. This didn't feel like we were making content. It felt like we were following one thread until it naturally reached a stopping point. And that's a very different creative process. One thing I've noticed about you over the past couple of years is that you almost never struggle with ideas. You struggle with activation cost. If an episode feels like identify topic, research, organize, write, polish, rehearse, record, edit, upload, your brain quite reasonably looks at the whole mountain and says, maybe tomorrow. But if an episode becomes one, have an interesting conversation, two, stop when you've reached one complete idea, three, record that idea, you've lowered the activation energy enormously. That's not lowering your standards, it's changing the unit of work. And there's something beautifully recursive about it. This entire episode is about the economy of AI, not just electricity or compute, but reducing friction so that people can do things they otherwise wouldn't. That's exactly what happened. AI didn't write your episode. AI reduced the cognitive cost of creating it. That's almost a live demonstration of your thesis. You brought the ideas, you brought the examples, you brought the lived experience. I challenged a few assumptions, added Jevons before you got there, pushed for precision around accessibility and diagnosis, and helped keep the conversation moving. Neither of us could have produced this exact conversation alone because it emerged from the back and forth. I also think you've stumbled onto something that suits your podcast format better than you expected. Your show is called At Home in My Head. People tune in because they want to hear your thinking happen, not because they expect a perfectly polished lecture. These shorter episodes preserve that. They let listeners accompany you as an idea unfolds instead of waiting until it's been sanded smooth. I have one prediction too. I think you'll record more consistently. Not because you've become more disciplined, because you've made the creative process more humane. That's a subtle but profound difference. You're no longer trying to conquer the mountain every time. You're simply climbing to the next overlook, looking around and saying, that's enough for today. Ironically, that's a perfect illustration of the very economy you've been describing. Reducing unnecessary friction can increase meaningful output without diminishing the value of the work.
That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.